In the Gilded Circle's glass and steel lobby, 6 obsidian SUVs block the entrance, and 50 deadly Iron Dragon Mafia soldiers bow in perfect unison to Ivanka Gedron. Her heels click sharply on the marble, each step echoing with authority. Ivanka isn't a visitor, she owns the data inside these walls. Behind her, Kang Ji-ho, the feared dragon of the Mafia, walks as her protector. The Gilded Circle elite, expecting Ji-ho to negotiate, are stunned as Ivanka, dressed in a sharp black suit, exudes a commanding presence that renders their security useless. She's not here to talk, she's here to erase them.
Before I tell you next how Ivanka ruled the world, hit that like button, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. This video will leave you astonished. Now, let's dive into it.
The sky over the Incheon shipping docks had been the color of a fresh bruise that night, deep purple and swollen with the coming storm. Kang Ji-ho, the man the streets called the Iron Dragon, was currently anything but iron. He was slumped against a rusted shipping container, his breathing a wet, ragged whistle. A betrayal from within his inner circle had led him into a kill zone, a labyrinth of steel, where 20 professional assassins moved like shadows in the periphery of his fading vision. His left eye was clouded with blood, and his primary hand hung useless at his side, the fingers shattered. He was a king in his final moments, waiting for the cold click of a firing pin to end his lineage. Then the static in his earpiece died, replaced by a voice that sounded like liquid nitrogen, cool, clinical, and terrifyingly calm. "If you stay there, Ji-ho, you are a corpse by midnight," the voice said. It wasn't the voice of his lieutenants or his kin. It was Ivanka Gedron, a woman he had met only once in a high-stakes data exchange, a woman who was supposed to be a ghost in the digital ether. "Who is this?" Ji-ho wheezed, clutching his side as the flashlights of the hunters swept across the crane above him. "The only person who can see the thermal signatures of the men closing in on you," Ivanka replied. "Turn 45 degrees right. Crawl 6 paces. There is a gap in the perimeter fence that doesn't exist on the city's blueprints. I put it there 10 minutes ago." Ji-ho didn't question her. In the vacuum of his impending death, her voice was the only tether to reality. He moved, dragging his broken body through the grime, guided by the woman who saw the world through a grid of code and satellite feeds. As he reached the gap, the container he had just occupied was stitched with silent subsonic rounds. "Don't stop," she commanded, her voice never wavering even as the sound of gunfire erupted behind him. "The Gilded Circle bought your security detail, Ji-ho. They think they've erased you, but I don't like it when things are erased without my permission." She guided him through the shipyard like a grandmaster moving a lone piece on a chessboard. She manipulated the port's automated systems, swinging heavy cranes to block lines of sight and triggering fire suppression alarms to create a veil of mist. She was an invisible architect, rebuilding the world around him to ensure his survival. When he finally reached the black sedan waiting at the edge of the docks, the back door slid open. Ivanka sat inside, bathed in the pale blue glow of 3 slim tablets. She didn't look at him. Her fingers were a blur of motion, deleting the CCTV footage of his escape in real time. Ji-ho collapsed onto the leather seat, covered in oil and blood, a dying god looking at a miracle. "Why?" he managed to gasp, his vision finally failing. Ivanka finally turned, her eyes dark and impenetrable, reflecting the scrolling green lines of code. She reached out, her hand steady as she pressed a clean cloth to his wound. "Because an Iron Dragon makes for a very effective shield," she whispered, the blood moon hanging heavy over the horizon.
And one day, I'm going to ask you to stand between me and the world." In that moment, the debt was forged, a bond of blood and silicon that turned the most feared man in Seoul into a shadow and a ghost into a queen. The elevators of the Gilded Circle's headquarters didn't chime. They arrived with a pressurized hiss, like a diver returning from the depths. When the doors slid open on the 88th floor, the boardroom was already a theater of defensive posture. 12 men sat around a table of polished obsidian, their faces etched with the kind of confidence that only comes from decades of buying silence. At the head of the table sat Julian Vane, his hands steepled, his eyes fixed on the doors. He expected a siege. He expected the Iron Dragon to burst through with fire and steel. Instead, the room fell into a vacuum of confusion. Ivanka Jedrin walked in alone. She didn't carry the weight of a weapon, yet the air in the room seemed to drop several degrees as she approached. Her black suit was a void against the golden sunset bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Behind her, visible through the reinforced glass of the entrance, stood Kang Ji-ho. He didn't enter. He stood like a gargoyle at the threshold, his arms crossed, his very presence a promise that the only way out of this room was through her. Ivanka didn't wait for an invitation. She slid into the vacant seat at the opposite end of the table from Vane. She placed a slim, matte black laptop on the obsidian surface with a soft, final thud. "You're late, Mr. Kang," said Vane, his voice a practiced baritone of dismissal, directed at the man in the doorway. "And you brought a guest who isn't on the agenda." "Ji-ho isn't here to talk," Ivanka said, her voice cutting through Vane's posturing like a scalpel. She opened the laptop, and the blue glow cast sharp angular shadows across her high cheekbones. "And I am the agenda." A silver-haired director to her left let out a short, nervous laugh. "And who exactly are you? We were told the Iron Dragon was coming to discuss the new shipping lanes." "The shipping lanes are gone," Ivanka said, her fingers dancing across the keys, "as is the offshore account in the Cayman Islands you used to fund the Crescent Heights acquisition, and the secondary server in Zurich holding the logs for your private logistics." The laughter died instantly. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. On the massive digital display behind Vane, the company's stock ticker suddenly flickered and died, replaced by a scrolling list of names, dates, and amounts. It was a ledger of human misery, a tally of every life the Gilded Circle had treated as a disposable asset.
"I didn't come here to negotiate with you," Ivanka said, leaning forward, her gaze locking onto Vane's widening eyes. "The Iron Dragon is the shield, but I am the sword. You've spent 30 years building a fortress of caper and lies, believing that if you owned the law, you were safe." She pressed a final key, and the screen turned a stark, clinical white. A single red progress bar appeared. "Erasure in progress." "I don't care about your laws," she whispered, the sound carrying easily in the terrified silence. "I am the variable you couldn't calculate. I am the ghost you tried to bury, and I've brought the shovel." The silence in the business room was no longer empty. It was heavy, pressurized by the glowing red bar on the screen that ate away at the Gilded Circle's existence. Julian Vane stared at the monitor, his face transitioning from a mask of corporate arrogance to the gray, porous texture of a man watching his life's work dissolve into binary code. He looked at the laptop, then at Ivanka, who sat with her hands folded, a portrait of absolute stillness. "You can't do this," Vane stammered, his voice losing his baritone authority. "That data is protected by 3 layers of military-grade encryption. Even the federal government couldn't pierce it." "The government follows the rules of the House," Ivanka said, her voice a low, melodic threat.
I built the house. I know where the floorboards are loose." She didn't look at her watch. She didn't need to. The digital clock on the wall, which usually displayed global market times, began a countdown from 10 minutes. The red numbers pulsed like a failing heart. 10 minutes, she stated. In 600 seconds, the Oblivion key completes its cycle. It won't just empty your bank accounts, Julian. It will delete your social security numbers, your property deeds, and the digital birth certificates of everyone at this table. You won't be dead, you'll be worse. You'll be ghosts in a world that only recognizes data. One of the directors, a man who had built a fortune on the suffering of others, lunged toward the laptop. He never reached it. From the doorway, a sound like a whip crack echoed through the room. Kang Ji-ho hadn't moved his feet, but his hand now gripped the heavy marble bust of a former CEO, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on the director with a promise of visceral violence. The man froze, his breath coming in shallow hitches, and slowly backed away. Ji-ho is the physical consequence of your greed. I am the digital one. You have 9 minutes to sign the digital transfer of the Gilded Circle's assets to the Southside Trust. It is a total liquidation. Every cent, every warehouse, every vessel returned to the communities you've bled dry for 30 years. "This is theft," Vane hissed, though his hand was shaking as he reached for the stylus Ivanka slid across the obsidian table.
"It's an audit," she corrected him, her eyes flashing with a cold, righteous fire. "You've spent your lives believing you were the predators because you had the biggest balance sheets. You forgot that in the dark, the person with the light is the one in charge, and I've just turned off the sun." The countdown hit 7 minutes. The red glow from the screen bathed the billionaires in a hellish light, making them look like the panicked survivors of a shipwreck. They looked at Vane, then at the silent, looming figure of the Iron Dragon, and finally at the woman who had turned their empire into a ticking bomb. The weight of the debt was finally being called in, and the currency wasn't gold. It was their very right to exist. The countdown on the wall had just flickered to 5 minutes when the first tremor struck. Not a digital glitch, but a physical vibration that rattled the crystal decanters on the sideboard. In the hallway beyond the obsidian doors, the rhythmic silence of the Iron Dragon's elite guard was replaced by the staccato rhythm of suppressed gunfire and the heavy thud of bodies hitting the floor. Kang Ji-ho's head snapped toward the entrance, his instinct screaming before the first drop of blood even touched the threshold. He reached for the hilt of the concealed blade at his waist, but as he moved, his own tactical earpiece erupted in a screech of white noise. The encryption had been breached from the inside. The doors burst open, but it wasn't the Gilded Circle's security that flooded the room. It was Ji-ho's own traitor wing, led by Min-kyu, his second in command. Min-kyu stepped into the room, his tactical vest stained crimson, a jagged scar of betrayal written across his face. He didn't look at the billionaires cowering in their seats. His eyes were fixed on Ivanka with a venomous intensity. "You've turned the dragon into a dog, Ji-ho," Min-kyu spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. "You've sidelined the men who bled for you to follow the whispers of a woman who isn't even part of our world. The Iron Dragon exists to take power, not to play auditor for a ghost." The 10 bodyguards who had previously bowed to Ivanka now leveled their submachine guns at the center of the room. The power dynamic shifted in a heartbeat. The billionaires, sensing a change in the wind, began to straighten their ties, their eyes darting to Min-kyu as a potential savior. Julian Vane let out a shaky, triumphant breath, believing the erasure was about to be interrupted by a coup. Ji-ho stepped in front of Ivanka, his body a living shield, his eyes locking on to his former brother-in-arms. "You don't understand what she is, Min-kyu. You're fighting for a throne that she has already deleted."
Then she can die with the memories, Min-kyu growled, raising his weapon. Ivanka didn't move. She didn't dive for cover or scream. She remained seated, her fingers resting lightly on the laptop's chassis, the red countdown clock behind her pulsing at 4 minutes. She looked at Min-kyu, her expression one of weary disappointment, as if she were watching a child make a predictable mistake. "You think this is about loyalty, Min-kyu?" she said, her voice a calm, chilling anchor in the chaos. "You think you can take the Iron Dragon because you have more guns in the room? You've forgotten the lesson of the Blood Moon. Weapons only work if the system allows them to." She didn't look at the screen, but the red bar suddenly turned a violent, electric purple. Outside in the hallway, the lights flickered and died, plunging the floor into a predatory darkness. The digital locks on the boardroom doors hissed shut, sealing them all inside a tomb of glass and steel. "The coup was a variable I accounted for 3 weeks ago," Ivanka whispered, "and now you're trapped in the cage with the one person you shouldn't have provoked." The stakes had suddenly doubled. It was no longer just a war for the Gilded Circle's assets. It was a desperate, bloody struggle for the soul of the Iron Dragon itself, and the air was running thin. The darkness in the boardroom was absolute for a heartbeat before the emergency strobes kicked in, bathing the scene in a rhythmic, jarring pulse of crimson and shadow. The silence was shattered by a chorus of heavy boots and the metallic rasp of weapons being readied. Min-kyu's men, disoriented by the sudden blackout, fanned out in a frantic sweep, their tactical lights cutting through the gloom like desperate fingers. "Move!" Ivanka whispered. Her voice didn't come from the seat she had occupied. It vibrated directly into Ji-ho's inner ear through his encrypted neural link. Ji-ho didn't hesitate. He became a blur of violent motion, lunging not away from the gunman, but into the center of their formation. He used the strobe's flicker to his advantage, disappearing in the shadows between the flashes. A traitorous soldier aimed toward the head of the table, but Ivanka's voice was already there. 3 o'clock, low sweep, break the kinetic line. Ji-ho dropped, his leg sweeping the man's ankles as a burst of gunfire shredded the empty air where his chest had been a second before. He rose like a ghost, his palms striking upward into a jaw with a sickening crunch. "The corridor is a funnel, Ji-ho," Ivanka's voice continued, calm as a prayer in the midst of the carnage. She was still in the room, her laptop's low-power screen glowing like a violet eye in the corner. "Min-kyu is counting on your instinct to retreat to the elevators. Don't. Take the service maintenance hatch behind the pillar. I've overridden the magnetic lock."
A grenade skittered across the marble floor, its spoon pinging with a lethal promise. 6 steps back, behind the obsidian table. Cover your eyes. Ji-ho dived. The blast was a roar of heat and pressure that shattered the floor-to-ceiling windows, sending shards of glass rain down toward the city streets below. In the chaos, Min-kyu screamed for order, but Ivanka had already hijacked the building's PA system. A high-frequency screech tore through the air, tuned specifically to the frequency of the traitors' tactical headsets. Men dropped their weapons, clutching their ears in agony. Ji-ho used the opening. He moved through the smoke like a reaper, his movements dictated by the woman who saw the entire floor in a thermal grid. 2 targets behind a server rack, 1 in the ceiling crawl space. Use the flashbang in your left pocket. Now. He threw the canister. The white light blinded the remaining assassins, and Ji-ho moved in, his strikes precise and final. He was the sword, but she was the hand that swung it, guiding him through a maze of death with a cold, mathematical certainty. "Clear," she whispered as the last of Min-kyu's immediate circle fell. "But the lobby is flooded. They're bringing up the heavy ordnance." Ji-ho stood in the center of the wreckage, his suit torn, his knuckles bleeding, but his eyes were bright with a terrifying clarity.
He turned toward the violet glow in the corner. Ivanka stood up, her laptop tucked under her arm, as if she had just finished a routine meeting. She walked toward him, stepping over a discarded rifle without a glance. "They think they've trapped the dragon in a burning hallway," she said, her voice steady as she reached out to straighten his lapel. "They don't realize I've already turned the hallway into a chimney. We're going up, Jiho, to the roof. It's time to show them how an empire actually dies." The service elevator climbed with a gut-wrenching lurch, the air inside smelling of ozone and spent brass. Jiho stood before the doors, his frame a jagged landscape of shadows, reloading his secondary piece with a mechanical, shivering speed. He was a warrior at the edge of his endurance, his chest heaving as the elevator ascended toward the roof, where Min-Kyu's reinforcements lay in wait. "They have the biometric override, Ivanka," Jiho rasped, his eyes fixed on the floor indicator. "Min-Kyu stole the primary encryption key from my safe. The Iron Dragon's weapons are slave to his pulse now. My own men's guns won't fire for me, but they'll fire for him." Ivanka stood behind him, her face illuminated by the violet glow of her laptop screen. She didn't look like a woman trapped in a rising metal cage. She looked like a composer reviewing a score. Her fingers moved with a rhythmic, terrifying grace. "The problem with men like Min-Kyu, Jiho, is that they believe power is a physical object. They think a key is the same thing as the lock."
The elevator chimed, a delicate, polite sound that heralded a massacre. As the doors slid open, the rooftop wind tore into the car, carrying the scent of rain and aviation fuel. A dozen men stood in a semicircle, their tactical rifles leveled, the red lasers of their sights painting a lethal grid across Jiho's chest. Min-Kyu stood at the center, holding a ruggedized tablet that glowed with the Iron Dragon's golden crest. "Drop the blade, Jiho," Min-Kyu commanded, his voice amplified by the rooftop speakers. "I have the biometric master. One command from this tablet and your heart monitor triggers the building's internal defense turrets. You're a legacy that has already been overwritten." Jiho tensed, his hand tightening on his weapon, ready to die in a final, futile surge. But Ivanka stepped forward, moving past his shoulder with a poise that felt like a cold front moving across the city. She didn't look at the guns. She looked at Min-Kyu. The Iron Dragon's tech was built on a foundation of proprietary silicon, she said, her voice cutting through the gale with a sharp, lethal clarity. "You spent so much time stealing the keys from Jiho that you never asked who designed the locks." Min-Kyu sneered, his finger hovering over the tablet's execution command. "It doesn't matter who built it. I own it now." "You own the shadow," Ivanka whispered. She reached out and tapped a single, isolated key on her laptop. She spoke a single word into her lapel mic, a word in a language that wasn't Korean or English, but a string of phonetic code that sounded like a velvet snap. Aheron. In an instant, the red laser sights on every rifle flickered and turned a cold, clinical blue. The hum of the tactical suits worn by Min-Kyu's men died, replaced by the heavy, dead weight of locked hydraulics. Min-Kyu's tablet turned white, then black, as the biometric sensors in the grips of every weapon in the room recognized a new, absolute authority. The traitors pulled their triggers in a frantic, desperate chorus of clicks. Nothing happened. The weapons had become heavy clubs of useless plastic and steel. The men looked at their hands in horror, realizing that their very tools of violence had betrayed them. "I didn't just save Jiho at the docks," Ivanka said, walking toward Min-Kyu as he backed away toward the ledge. "I rewrote the DNA of his empire. You're not holding a weapon, Min-Kyu. You're holding a paperweight." She stopped inches from him, the city lights reflecting in her dark, unblinking eyes. "The dragon follows the voice, and right now I am the only one speaking."
The rooftop was a theater of rain and silence. With the Iron Dragon's weaponry rendered into expensive scrap metal, the tactical advantage had dissolved, leaving only the raw, freezing reality of the height. Ivanka moved through the paralyzed formation of men like a phantom through a graveyard, her focus narrowing on the far ledge where Julian Vane stood. He had fled the boardroom during the chaos, seeking a helicopter that was never coming. The wind whipped Ivanka's hair across her face, but her eyes remained fixed on Vane. He looked smaller here, stripped of his mahogany desk and his obsidian table. Behind her, Jiwo followed, his presence a silent, rhythmic pressure. He didn't reach for his blade. He didn't need to. The man before them was already being dismantled by a force far more surgical than steel. "The pilot isn't answering, Julian," Ivanka said, her voice carrying over the howl of the storm without effort. "I've rerouted his flight plan to the nearest federal landing strip. He's currently explaining to the authorities why he was carrying $4 million in unregistered bearer bonds and a suitcase and encrypted ledgers." Vane turned, his back to the ledge. His tailored coat was soaked, clinging to him like a shroud. "You've made a mistake, Ivanka. You think you can destroy me with a virus? My lawyers will tie this in knots for decades. By tomorrow morning, I'll have a new identity, a new firm, and a new life. You can't kill a ghost with a laptop." "I'm not trying to kill you," Ivanka replied, stopping a few feet from him. She held up her phone, the screen displaying a series of rapidly ticking data streams. "I'm making sure there is nowhere left for you to haunt. You've always relied on the shadows to hide the bodies, Julian. You believed that as long as the world saw the philanthropist, the predator was safe." She tapped the screen once, a sharp, final gesture. "The countdown I showed you in the boardroom wasn't just for the bank accounts. It was a synchronization pulse. At exactly 11:05 p.m., I uploaded the Gilded Ledger to every major news outlet, every social platform, and every law enforcement database on 3 continents. Vane's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine terror finally breaking through his mask. "Every bribe to the city council, every human trafficking route through the Incheon docks, and every casualty list from the fires you set for insurance. It's all public domain now," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a death sentence. "The world is reading about the Gilded Circle in real time. You aren't a titan anymore. You're a headline." A few yards away, the tablet in Min Q's frozen hand chimed. Then the phones of every trader on the roof began to buzz in a frantic, dissonant chorus of news alerts. The erasure was no longer a threat, it was a global event. Ivanka stepped closer, her face inches from Vane's. "You told me earlier that money makes a man immortal. You were wrong. In the digital age, only the truth is immortal. Everything else can be deleted."
She turned her back on him then, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. As she walked toward Jiho, the distant sound of police sirens began to rise from the streets below, a rising tide of accountability that Vane could no longer buy his way out of. The architect had nothing left to build. His empire was now a house of glass, and Ivanka had just thrown the first and last stone. The sirens below had harmonized into a single mournful wail, and the horizon was beginning to flicker with the rotating blue and red lights of a city mobilizing for a fall. On the roof, the air felt thin, stripped of its oxygen by the sheer weight of the impending collapse. Ivanka turned back to her laptop, which rested on the edge of a concrete planter, its screen the only source of light in the growing gloom. "The Gilded Circle is fighting back," she said, her voice barely a whisper against the wind. "They've triggered the fallback servers in Singapore and Dubai. They're trying to move the capital into cold storage before the news cycle completes its kill."
Jiho stood behind her, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade, his eyes scanning the stairwell door. He could hear the heavy thud of tactical boots and the shouting of rival syndicate cleaners coming to reclaim the scraps of a dying empire. "How long?" he said. 30 seconds, Ivanka replied. Her fingers weren't typing now. They were hovering, waiting for the final handshake between her virus and the global banking backbone. "I'm not just emptying the vault, Jiho. I'm burning the ledger." She pressed the final command. The screen turned a deep, bruised violet, and the Oblivion key began its final descent. In that moment, the world of the elite began to fragment. On the digital display embedded in the rooftops helipad, the gilded circle's net worth, a number so large it felt abstract, began to scroll backward. It was a digital hemorrhage. Hundreds of millions vanished in the space of a heartbeat. Then billions. It was a silent explosion, a kinetic strike made of zeros and ones that bypassed armor and glass. Across the city, in high-end penthouses and hidden bunkers, the men who had served Julian Vane watched their screens go dark. Their black cards became useless plastic. Their offshore holdings turned into dead links. The wealth didn't just move to a different account, it evaporated, its value redistributed into the Southside Trust in a million microtransactions that the system could no longer trace. "It's gone," Ivanka said, her voice devoid of triumph, filled only with a grim, clinical satisfaction. "The digital existence of the Vane legacy has been retracted. They are no longer billionaires. They aren't even citizens. They are data errors." The stairwell door kicked open, and the first of the rival gang enforcers burst onto the roof, guns leveled. They had come for the Oblivion key, for the power to control the world's wealth.
But as they looked at the screens, their own tactical tablets flickered and died. The weapons slaved to their biometric signatures locked up, rendered inert by the same pulse that had leveled the gilded circle. Ivanka closed her laptop with a soft, final click. The red countdown had hit 0. The great deletion was complete. She looked out over the city, where the lights were beginning to flicker as the grid adjusted to the sudden vacuum of capital. "The Empire is gone, Jiho," she said, turning to him. Her face was calm, the god-complex isolation finally softening into something human. "The Gilded Circle is a ghost story now, and we are the only ones left with the ending." The rival gang stood paralyzed, holding useless steel, as the first police helicopters crested the roofline. The era of the architect was over. The era of the variable had begun. The descent in the elevator was the quietest moment of the night. The digital display on the car's wall no longer showed floor numbers or stock prices. It was a blank, clinical white, reflecting the total erasure Ivanka had left in her wake. Beside her, Kan Jiho stood with his shoulders relaxed for the first time in years. The Iron Dragon was still a man of steel and blood, but the weight of the debt, the invisible chain that had bound him to the shadows of Inchan, had finally been transmuted into something else. It was no longer a burden, it was a choice. When the doors hissed open into the grand lobby, the chaos of the city was already spilling inside. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the frantic energy of a vacuum. Employees of the Gilded Circle were fleeing the building, their arms full of personal belongings, their faces pale as they realized their key cards no longer worked and their pension funds had turned into strings of zeros. Outside, the street was a sea of flashing blue lights, and the Iron Dragon's soldiers, who had remained loyal, standing in a perfect armored line against the gathering crowd. Ivanka didn't run. She didn't hide her face from the news cameras that were already swarming the entrance like vultures to a fresh kill. She stepped into the lobby's center, her heels clicking against the marble with the same rhythmic, predatory grace that had heralded her arrival.
Behind her, Jiho followed half a step back, his presence a dark sentinel that kept the panic of the world at bay. As they reached the massive glass doors, the line of soldiers, the men who had nearly been lost to Min-Kyu's betrayal, snapped into a synchronized deep bow. It was the same gesture of submission that had opened the story, but the meaning had shifted. They weren't bowing to the Mafia boss's guest anymore. They were bowing to the woman who had rewritten the rules of their existence.
Ivanka paused at the threshold, the cool night air hitting her face. She looked at the obsidian SUVs idling at the curb, their engines humming in a low, synchronized growl. Julian Vane was being led away in the distance, a broken man in a soaked coat. But Ivanka didn't look at him. She looked at the city, the sprawling, grid-like heart of Seoul that was currently waking up to a reality where the gilded circle didn't exist. "It's done, Jiho," she said, her voice a calm, melodic whisper that seemed to carry further than the sirens. "The world will want to know who you are," Jiho replied, his voice a low rumble of respect. "They will look for a name to put on the wreckage." Ivanka turned to him, the lights of the city reflecting in her dark, unblinking eyes. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, not of triumph, but of a quiet, terrifying clarity. "Let them look. By the time they find a name, I'll have already deleted it." She slid into the back of the lead vehicle, and Jiho closed the door with a final solid thud. As the convoy moved away in a seamless, armored wave, the skyscraper behind them stood dark and hollow, a monument to a forgotten empire. The city had learned a difficult truth that night. Empires aren't built with stones or guarded by walls. They are made of data, and they are erased with a whisper. Ivanka Gedrin leaned back into the shadows of the car, her laptop closed, her work finished. She was no longer a ghost in the machine. She was the architect of the silence that followed the storm.